In 1878, deep in the scorched prairies of Kansas, stood a lonely homestead that locals avoided like a curse. Its dusty fields whispered of toil and hardship, but what truly festered there was far darker, an enigma so grotesque that even the brightest scientific minds refused to examine it. That land belonged to the Whitmore family, more precisely to four brothers who shared eerie, almost identical features. Sunken eyes that seemed too knowing, smiles that never quite reached their eyes, and movements so perfectly in sync it unsettled anyone who watched. From childhood they were a curiosity. By adolescence they had become a source of dread. Livestock wandered too close and vanished without a trace. Travelers spoke of silhouettes watching them from the corn rows, standing impossibly still until they blinked, and the figures were gone. On moonless nights, faint high-pitched wails drifted across the plains, chased by bursts of coarse, unnatural laughter that froze the blood of anyone within earshot. But nothing prepared the small community of Hayes for what was eventually uncovered in the Whitmore barn one bitter December morning. No doctor dared draft an official report. No major paper printed the full story. It was easier to brand it folklore than to accept that such horror could fester in the heart of Kansas. Are you brave enough to hear what happened to the four Whitmore brothers? Then stay with us. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unsettling tale. Do it now, before the darkness outside your window decides to listen too. Chapter 1. The Beginning of Strangeness. The summer of 1878 was cruel even by Kansas standards. Sunlight scorched the endless plains, splitting the earth into jagged cracks wide enough to swallow a man's boot. Dust drifted like a living thing, seeping under doors and coating every surface with a thin, choking film. Crops withered. Wells dried to muddy trickles. Families packed wagons and left under the pitiless gaze of the sun, hoping to outrun starvation. But on the outskirts of Hayes, the Whitmore brothers stayed. Their homestead was a modest patch of land hemmed in by crude fences and stubborn rows of corn that somehow thrived while neighboring fields lay barren. Some said it was the soil, darker, richer than elsewhere. Others claimed it was the brothers' tireless work, their silhouettes always visible at dawn and dusk, moving together down the furrows like a single creature with four heads. But there were whispers too, darker than superstition. Old widows spat and crossed themselves at the mention of the Whitmores, muttering of unclean bargains and spirits that walk in daylight. The brothers, Ephraim, Silas, Jonah, and little Abel, kept mostly to themselves. No barn dances, no church picnics, no trading stories over whiskey at the general store. When they came into town, it was always together, always silent, with their pale eyes darting over people like they were studying livestock. Shopkeepers learned not to linger in conversation. A quick nod, an even quicker transaction, and the Whitmores would be gone, leaving behind a chill that took hours to shake. It might have remained just local gossip, the sort of uneasy folklore that grows wherever loneliness festers. But that August things began to change. It started with the animals. Small things at first, feral cats, stray dogs, even jackrabbits that ventured too close to the Whitmore fields. Children sometimes found carcasses near the creek, laid out in neat lines as if carefully arranged. There was no sign of blood. No visible wounds. Only eyes wide open, mouths contorted in frozen screams. The town's doctor, an aging Scotsman named Dr. McTavish, examined a few and could offer no explanation. Fright, he muttered, baffled, though what could frighten a jackrabbit to death he would not speculate. Then it was the neighbors. The Hemphills, who lived a mile east, spoke of hearing strange chanting carried on the dry night air. Mr. Hemphill rode over one evening to investigate. He returned pale and shaking, refusing to say what he'd seen. Weeks later he packed up his wife and daughter and left Kansas altogether. By September, even the local pastor, Reverend Tucker, a stern man who feared God far more than any earthly rumor, paid the Whitmores a visit. He rode out alone one blistering afternoon, a leather Bible clutched tight in one hand, the other resting on the pistol at his hip. He did not return by nightfall. A search party found his horse wandering near the Whitmore fence line, froth at its mouth, eyes rolling wild. Reverend Tucker was discovered hours later, stumbling down the road toward Hayes, clothes torn, Bible missing. When they tried to question him, he only repeated a single verse over and over, voice rising to a cracked shriek. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, the Lord is my shepherd," until finally collapsing in the dust. He never preached again, confined to his bed with fits of violent trembling. Despite all this, the Whitmores seemed untouched by the malaise gripping the rest of the county. Their corn stood green and high. Their cattle grew fat. Even through October's sudden hailstorms and November's early frosts, Their land prospered as if watched over by some dark providence. People tried to mind their own business, tried to look away. After all, in desperate times, envy was a dangerous spark. Maybe, they reasoned, the Whitmores were simply better farmers, tougher stock. Maybe the strange deaths, the eerie songs, the trembling preacher, maybe these were coincidences strung together by fearful minds. That fragile reasoning shattered in early December. It was a Sunday morning when young Samuel Pratt, all of 10 years old, went chasing his hound down the road that ran behind the Whitmore property. The dog squeezed under a gap in the fence and vanished into the corn. Samuel, cursing under his breath, followed. He was inside the rows only moments before he froze. There, less than 20 feet ahead, stood Ephraim Whitmore. Or maybe Silas. Or Jonah. It was impossible to tell. His back was turned, broad shoulders draped in a frayed shirt, straw hat tilted forward. At his feet was something Samuel couldn't see. The brothers' hands moved in slow, deliberate motions, up and down as if working some hidden task. Samuel tried to step backward, but a dry stalk snapped under his boot. The brother's head twisted unnaturally far around, eyes locking with Samuel's. A smile spread across that narrow face, wide, too wide, stretching almost ear to ear. His hands, slick with something dark, rose in greeting. Samuel ran. He didn't stop until he burst through his own front door, sobbing so violently his mother thought he was having a fit. It took hours to calm him enough to speak, and even then all he could manage was, "His mouth, Mama." His mouth was too big. That same night, a cold wind swept through haze, rattling window panes and driving families to stoke their fires higher. But over at the Whitmore homestead, lanterns burned late into the small hours. Silhouettes moved behind thin curtains, gathering and separating in patterns that suggested not 4 men, but something more numerous, something that multiplied in the dark. By dawn, the dog was found on the Pratt porch, stiff as a board, mouth agape in that same silent scream that had haunted Dr. McTavish all autumn. The first of many such mornings. Samuel Pratt's story spread like wildfire. By evening, half of Hayes knew about the boy's terrified flight, the grotesque smile he described, and the lifeless dog that now lay stretched on the Pratt porch with its jaws locked open. Men gathered at the saloon, voices hushed, trading grim theories over sweating mugs of beer. Some claimed it was just the imagination of a scared child, stirred up by local gossip. Others weren't so sure. After all, hadn't there always been something wrong about the Whitmore place? Mrs. Langley, an old widow who lived nearest to the Whitmores, confessed to her daughter that for weeks she'd woken in the night to see lanterns bobbing along the Whitmore fence line. Too many lanterns, more than 4, weaving and dancing as if held by invisible hands. A ranch hand named Dougal swore he saw the brothers out in their field under the full moon, digging together. The hole, he said, was wider than any grave he'd ever dug, and something was moving at the bottom of it, shifting and rustling like a sack full of angry rats. But what chilled the townsfolk most was the account of old Sheriff Buckley. One evening, under growing pressure from the town council, Buckley reluctantly saddled his mare and rode out to have a word with the Whitmore clan. He found them on the porch, seated in 4 identical rocking chairs, all swaying in perfect unison. When Buckley hailed them, they didn't rise or greet him, just smiled those narrow, off-kilter smiles. He asked if everything was all right on their property. Ephraim, at least Buckley thought it was Ephraim, answered in a soft, almost musical voice that all was well. But as he spoke, the sheriff felt a crawling sensation on his neck, like tiny legs skittering over his skin. He glanced up at the eaves of the porch and swore he saw dozens of tiny shadows darting back into the cracks of the wood, shapes that didn't belong to any bird or bat he'd ever known. Buckley left without pressing further questions. When he returned to town, he was pale, sweating, and unusually quiet. That night, his deputy found him drunk and weeping on the steps of the jailhouse, muttering, "Their eyes, all 4 of them. Same eyes, same mouths, not right at all." As December crept on, the weather turned savage. Bitter winds howled through Kansas, driving needles of ice across the plains. Families huddled indoors, feeding the stove with anything that would burn. The Whitmore farm, however, remained strangely active. Lights moved from barn to house to field, even in the worst of the storms, and sometimes thin voices rose above the wail of the wind, chanting in a language no one could recognize. The final straw came on Christmas Eve. Young Josephine Langley, only 14, disappeared while fetching water from the well behind her mother's house. Her footprints led straight toward the Whitmore farm. No one dared to follow them, not even her desperate mother, who stood wailing at the edge of the road until her voice gave out. The next morning, a crude parcel was found on the Langleys' doorstep, a small bundle of burlap tied with coarse twine. Inside was Josephine's Sunday bonnet, soaked through with something dark that smelled of copper and rot. Her family packed their belongings by nightfall, abandoning the homestead to the cold. From then on, the rest of Hayes steered wide of the Whitmore property. Riders would go 10 miles out of their way to avoid the stretch of road that ran past their cornfields. The postman started leaving mail in a box by the general store, refusing to deliver it himself. Even Dr. McTavish, who once prided himself on treating any patient no matter their reputation, quietly burned the letter that arrived with a Whitmore seal one frostbitten morning. No one blamed him. By the time the year ended, the Whitmore brothers were ghosts in the eyes of Hayes, visible only at the fringes, haunting the periphery of every hearthside story. But in the lonely hours before dawn, when winds prowled through the town like hunting beasts, many swore they heard faint laughter drifting over the prairie. A laughter that did not belong to any man. And with that, the final seeds of dread were planted, rooting deep in the hearts of all who dared remember the four brothers of Kansas. Chapter 2: Secrets Hidden on the Farm. As the cold deepened, the Whitmore farm seemed to grow ever more alive. While the rest of Kansas lay smothered under blankets of frost, the Whitmore house glowed each night with lantern light, shadows capering wildly across the frost-glazed windows. Faint music, played on an off-key fiddle, sometimes drifted all the way to town. But there was never any joy in those wavering notes, only a shrill, searching quality that left listeners uneasy, as if something blind and hungry was fumbling through the dark, trying to find its way inside their minds. By January, the men of Hayes could no longer bear the mounting tension. Led by a rancher named Carl Jensen, who had lost 2 prize colts after they'd strayed too close to the Whitmore fence, a small posse set out to pay the brothers a visit. They wore stiff expressions and carried rifles at the ready. Though no one spoke of violence, each man's hand hovered near the trigger guard. They approached under a leaden sky, boots crunching on frozen earth. When the house came into view, Jensen lifted his hand and the group slowed. Smoke rose in lazy curls from the chimney, and faint laughter trickled from the barn. A thin, breathless giggling that sounded far too childish to belong to grown men. The men looked at one another uneasily. They decided to check the barn first. Its doors hung slightly ajar, swaying with the breeze. As they stepped closer, the smell hit them, sweet and cloying like rotting fruit left too long in the sun, layered over something sharper that burned the nostrils. Inside was darkness that seemed to press against their eyes. When Jensen pushed the door open, the hinges shrieked loud enough to raise gooseflesh. What the lanterns revealed was no ordinary barn. The rafters were strung with hundreds of small bones, birds, rabbits, rodents, woven together in grotesque dangling chains that clicked softly whenever the wind found a crack. Along the far wall, a circle had been carefully scraped into the dirt floor, its grooves blackened with some thick, tarry substance. Strange symbols sprawled out from it like spider legs, crawling up the wooden beams. At the center lay a collection of objects that none of the men could later fully describe, knotted shapes that seemed to twitch at the corners of their vision as if trying to look back. And then there were the jars. Dozens lined rough shelves along one wall, stoppered with crude wax seals. They were filled with murky liquid that held lumps of things. Some looked like twisted roots. Others seemed almost human in their miniature proportions, though grotesquely malformed. One jar contained something that pressed tiny palms against the glass as if pleading for release, its blind face frozen in a perpetual scream. Jensen stepped forward, hand trembling as he raised the lantern higher. The circle of light slid across the dirt, and stopped on a pair of bare footprints perfectly formed, small as a child's, but with too many toes splayed in unnatural angles. The prints wandered around the circle and vanished beneath a loose plank. A creak came from the rafters above. The men snapped their heads up, rifles lifting. Something long and pale slipped back into the shadows, too quick, too silent to be an owl or raccoon. One of the younger ranch hands, Henry Dobbs, let out a strangled cry and bolted from the barn, nearly dropping his rifle in his panic. The others followed quickly, none eager to be the last man out. Once outside, they found the house's front door open, the Whitmore brothers standing on the porch. Each held a lantern that cast their identical faces in shifting amber light. Their mouths were stretched in polite, curious smiles, but their eyes remained cold and still. "Gentlemen," said Ephraim, voice smooth as fresh cream. "A bitter morning to be out. Won't you come inside, warm yourselves by our fire?" His brothers chuckled low at this, the sound harmonizing strangely, too perfectly as if practiced. Jensen tightened his grip on his rifle. "We were just looking for strays," he muttered. "Didn't mean to intrude." Silas tilted his head, the lantern glow making his eyes flash gold. "And did you find what you were seeking, Mr. Jensen?" No one answered. Jensen simply nodded stiffly, then began backing away, boots crunching in retreat. The others followed, rifles held defensively across their chests. They did not lower their weapons until the Whitmore house was a distant shape behind them, swallowed by the swirling mist that rose off the frosted fields. When they returned to Hayes, no one spoke much of what they had found. Some claimed it was best not to stir up more fear in a town already buckling under winter's hardships. Others suspected that speaking of it might somehow give it power, might draw the Whitmores' attention back upon them. But rumors have a way of spreading even in silence. People began to talk of odd births among the local cattle, calves with 2 heads or no eyes, piglets born with grotesque human-like teeth. Some claimed that the streams near the Whitmore farm ran slick and red at dawn, as if they bled under the weight of hidden sins. Old Mrs. Langley, from her new lodging in Abilene, sent word that she'd taken to covering every mirror in her home, terrified that she might catch a glimpse of a pale figure watching her from over her shoulder, smiling, always smiling. Meanwhile, inside the Whitmore homestead, the brothers thrived. Their fields stayed strangely lush despite bitter freezes that killed crops all across Kansas. Travelers who dared come near the place sometimes glimpsed figures moving through the rows at night, too tall, too thin, limbs bending in ways that no human limb should bend. And still the fiddle played, night after night, that same wandering tune that clawed at the mind like icy fingers. No lawman returned to investigate. No pastor tried to intervene. In truth, the people of Hayes settled into an uneasy arrangement with their fear. So long as they kept their distance, perhaps the Whitmores would keep to theirs. Perhaps no more children would vanish. Perhaps the cold laughter that sometimes echoed across the prairie was just the wind after all. But beneath these fragile hopes lay a darker current. A collective, unspoken certainty that the Whitmore farm was no longer a place of men, but of something else entirely, wearing borrowed skin and borrowed smiles, learning slowly how to be human by studying the terror of those who dared look too close. Jensen tried to sleep that night, but his dreams were fractured things. Visions of bone chains swaying gently in a barn that had no end, of jars rattling on shelves while tiny hands drummed frantically against the glass. More than once he woke with a strangled shout, drenched in sweat despite the bitter cold. He wasn't alone. By morning, 3 other men from the posse reported similar nightmares. One spoke of seeing Ephraim Whitmore standing by the foot of his bed, lips moving in silent prayer, eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Another found muddy, barefoot prints on his porch at dawn, prints with too many toes, matching those they'd seen circling the strange symbols in the barn. Within a week, Henry Dobbs was dead. His family found him hanging from a beam in their hayloft, eyes bulged and tongue blackened, fingers dug so deep into the noose they bled even after death. When they cut him down, something small and pale tumbled from his shirt pocket. His father picked it up, thinking it was just a scrap of cloth, until it unfurled on his palm. A tiny hand, perfectly formed, no bigger than a walnut, its fingers curling ever so slightly as if trying to grip his skin. The family fled Kansas that very night. As winter deepened, so did the town's collective dread. People crossed themselves when they saw the Whitmores in town, for broad shapes moving as one along the boardwalk. Shopkeepers scrambled to fill their orders quickly, never meeting their eyes. And always there was that smell, sweet rot barely masked by the sharp bite of winter air, clinging to the brothers like an invisible cloak. It was Mrs. Hawthorne, the midwife, who finally broke. One evening she burst into the saloon, skirts caked with mud, eyes wild and unfocused. She claimed she'd been summoned to the Whitmore house for a birth, not by any letter or messenger, but by a voice that spoke inside my skull, whispering the address over and over. Against her better judgment, she'd hitched her cart and gone. What she found there shattered whatever fragile courage she possessed. "They were all waiting for me," she rasped, rocking in place as the men crowded around. "Standing in their parlor with lanterns that didn't burn right, more smoke than light. They led me upstairs. There was a girl on the bed, maybe 14, belly stretched near to bursting. Her eyes were sewn shut, I tell you, with black thread. And she was humming like a lullaby, only wrong." Mrs. Hawthorne clawed at her hair, voice rising to a shriek. "When it was done, they didn't wrap it in swaddling or offer it to me. They just stood there, staring at the thing in the cradle. It had too many mouths. It laughed at me. It laughed." No one in the saloon spoke. Someone pressed a whiskey into her hands, which she drained in one desperate gulp before sinking to the floor in sobs. From that night forward, the people of Hayes avoided the Whitmores entirely. Deliveries were left at the edge of their land and no one dared knock on their door. Even passing by on horseback, travelers reported hearing strange coos drifting from the windows, soft baby noises that would sometimes warp mid-breath into hoarse chuckles far too deep for any infant. Then the dreams began to spread, first among the men who'd gone to the barn, then their families, then neighbors who lived miles away. They all described similar scenes, standing in endless fields under a dark sky, watching countless small shapes move between the cornstalks. Shapes that giggled and whispered, promising secrets if only you'd come closer, step into the rows, join hands and never look back. By the end of February, the town of Hayes was a husk of itself. Half its homes stood empty, abandoned by families who left under cover of night. Those who remained did so out of poverty or stubborn pride, barricading their doors come sundown and reciting prayers until dawn. As for the Whitmores, they seemed to thrive like weeds after a storm. Their house gleamed with new paint. The fields grew thick even under snow. On certain nights, dozens of lanterns danced across their land, too many for 4 men, too many by far, and faint music floated on the wind, a melody that sounded almost human, until you listened closely, and heard the extra voices underneath, giggling in broken harmony. Chapter 3: The Unspeakable Experiments. By early March, the frost began to retreat from the Kansas plains, revealing dead grass and brittle roots beneath. But around the Whitmore farm, life flourished in a riot of impossible green. Thick clumps of strange ivy climbed fence posts, burst across rooftops, and crawled down into the cellar doors like eager fingers. No one dared approach to cut it back. It might have remained that way, a silent standoff, terror nesting comfortably in the cracks of everyday life, if not for young Caleb Jensen. Restless and raw from grief over his brother Henry's suicide, Caleb fell easily into the coaxing arms of whiskey. And whiskey in turn made him reckless. One night, fueled by equal parts rage and sorrow, he saddled his old mule and rode out under a swollen, veined moon toward the Whitmore property. "I'll put an end to this," he slurred to the darkness. "No more haunting dreams. No more dead kids. I'll burn it all down." Caleb tied his mule by the gate, rifle slung over one shoulder, lantern clenched tight. He crossed the field, boots sinking into lush, unnatural soil that seemed to pulse faintly beneath him. Near the barn he paused. A sound drifted from inside, soft, warbling, almost like a lullaby sung by multiple voices all trying to follow different tunes. His hand trembled as he pushed the door open. Inside, the shadows bloomed. Shapes writhed across the walls, long, spindly things that moved independent of the lantern's flicker. And there, clustered in the center of the barn, sat a circle of children. Or at least they might have once been children. They were small, yes, but their limbs were too thin, too jointed in the wrong places. Their skin was a patchwork of hues, ashy white, bruised purple, oozing black, and their faces were horrors of half-formed features. Some had no eyes, just sunken pits that wept clear fluid. Others bore mouths that stretched ear to ear, packed with tiny needling teeth. A few lifted hands with too many fingers, waving at Caleb in gentle greeting. At the heart of their circle lay something even worse, a mass that pulsed and twisted, tendrils unfurling toward the children as they giggled and rocked. Tiny mouths opened along its surface, whispering, "Hungry, hungry, hungry," in overlapping voices that didn't match the movements of the lips. Caleb's mind rebelled. He staggered backward while burning his throat, but a sudden pressure gripped his shoulders. He twisted around. It was Ephraim, smiling broadly. The other brothers stood behind him, all 4 dressed in immaculate Sunday coats, eyes bright and feverish. Ephraim leaned close, breath hot on Caleb's cheek. "Beautiful, aren't they?" he murmured. "Our legacy. Our future. The world above never understood us, but down here, oh, we found such eager teachers." Caleb tried to lift his rifle. Jonah caught it easily, twisting it from his hands. Silas gripped Caleb's jaw, forcing his mouth open. Abel leaned close, something slick and wriggling cupped in his palm. Before Caleb could even scream, they shoved it between his lips. It tasted like copper and mold, sliding down his throat of its own accord, burrowing, nestling. His vision erupted in blotches of color. Somewhere distant, he heard his own voice join the chorus of hungry whispers. Then everything went black. 2 days later, Caleb Jensen was found wandering down the main road into Hayes. His hair had turned stark white, skin papery and puckered in strange patterns along his neck and chest. When approached, he just smiled, a wide, unnatural grin, and began humming that same lurching lullaby that had haunted so many dreams. When the sheriff tried to question him, Caleb simply leaned forward and whispered, "They're so lonely, won't you come see them too?" That night, the Jensen homestead burned to the ground. Whether it was Caleb himself or some desperate act by his grieving parents, no one ever proved. The family disappeared, never seen again. Only scorched foundations remained, quickly swallowed by spring weeds. With each passing week, more people left Hayes. Houses stood empty, doors banging open in the prairie winds. Those who stayed kept to tight circles, whispering prayers over meals, nailing crucifixes above every threshold. Yet it did little good. Because by then the Whitmore children, if one could even call them that, had begun to wander. Small shapes were seen at the edge of lantern light, crouched under porches or peering through cracks in stable walls. Cattle lowed in terror at night, eyes rolling white, refusing to go near the water troughs where tiny handprints sometimes appeared in the morning dew. Dogs vanished from yards, their tethers found snapped clean as if by something with far more strength than its size suggested. Once, a group of men caught sight of 4 such shapes darting between trees near the church cemetery. They gave chase, lanterns swinging wildly. What they found instead was a shallow pit. Inside lay bundles wrapped in cloth, dozens of them squirming faintly, tiny muffled cries leaking out. Some of the men retched. Others drew pistols and fired into the pile until everything went still. But that night, every man who had drawn a weapon awoke to find their hands blistered and blackened, skin peeling from knuckles to wrist. By dawn, 2 had died, blood gone thick and tarry in their veins. Through it all, the Whitmore brothers continued their careful, polite life. They rode into town exactly once a month to collect supplies: flour, salt, lamp oil, always paying in full with crisp bills. They tipped their hats to shopkeepers, offered courteous greetings to passers-by. And always they smiled. Yet behind those smiles lurked something hungry. Something that watched the dwindling town of Hayes like a wolf circling a crippled lamb. It was Dr. McTavish who finally snapped under the weight of it. He spent 3 nights scribbling frantic notes by candlelight, cataloging every unnatural birth, every whispered nightmare, every corpse that turned up with its mouth frozen in that hideous O of terror. Then he packed his bags and fled Kansas entirely. His journal, left behind by accident or fear, was found later under his bed. Inside, one passage was underlined so fiercely the nib had torn through the paper. "They are not studying us. They are breeding us, preparing us for something we cannot yet comprehend." By the time April rolled over the plains, Hayes was a ghost town. Homes stood hollow, streets rutted and empty. The only true life thrived on the Whitmore land, where the fields lay thick and the barn eaves sagged under the weight of nesting shadows. Some nights, travelers passing miles off still claimed to hear that twisted fiddle song riding the breeze. And if they strained their eyes toward the horizon, they might see lanterns dancing, a procession of small figures trailing after 4 tall men, all moving in perfect eerie unison. And sometimes, if the wind died entirely, they could swear the ground itself was breathing. As spring advanced, the unnatural life on the Whitmore farm only grew wilder. Strange flowers, slick and glistening like wet tongues, bloomed among the corn. Their scent was overpoweringly sweet, drawing bees that landed, twitched once and fell dead into the grass. Crows flocked there too but never left. Black shapes perched along the fence, eyes dull, watching the road with eerie patience. Travelers began choosing far longer routes just to avoid the stretch near Hayes. Even those who had never heard the full stories felt an instinctive dread, horses balking and sweating when the wind carried that sickly perfume. But the Whitmore brothers seemed utterly undisturbed. They walked their fields each dusk, lanterns swinging, soft voices rising together in what might have been hymns if they didn't curl at the edges with laughter. Sometimes, small figures scampered alongside them, quick, many-legged blurs that melted back into the stalks whenever anyone dared to look directly. Then came the rains. Late one night, clouds gathered without warning, swallowing the moon in boiling darkness. Thunder cracked so close it rattled windows for miles. Sheets of rain hammered the earth, beating down so hard it seemed the very ground might crack open. And in that deluge something did. Early the next morning, a pair of cattle drovers stumbled onto a flooded hollow behind the Whitmore barn. The swollen ground had given way, revealing a pit beneath, a vast warren of burrows and chambers, some braced with beams crudely carved with symbols no man could read. Inside lay horrors that twisted the drovers' minds. Half-formed shapes clung to the walls, pulsing and sighing, feeding on thick ropes of root that snaked through the mud. Tiny eyes blinked open all at once, fixing on the intruders with a terrible, yearning hunger. The men ran until their lungs burned raw. One dropped dead before reaching town, heart simply stopping. The other raved for 2 days about the nursery under the fields, before biting off his own tongue. He survived but never spoke again. By then even the last stubborn families packed their wagons. Hayes became nothing more than sagging houses and shuttered windows, A town whose silence was only broken by the distant, drifting notes of that off-kilter fiddle. Yet still the Whitmores remained. And it was on one especially still night, no wind, no moon, just a vast suffocating hush, that a group of bounty hunters rode in. Hired by distant relatives of the families who'd lost children, they came with rifles, torches, and cruel purpose. Hardened men who'd hunted bandits and Comanche raiders, convinced no farmstead could truly frighten them. They surrounded the Whitmore house just past midnight. The leader, a grizzled man named Reese, signaled 2 of his men to the back. The rest approached the front door, torches already lit, ready to flush out whatever devils waited inside. Ephraim opened the door before they could even knock. He stood in the warm glow of the foyer lamp, coat neatly buttoned, hair combed, smile gentle. "Evening, gentlemen," he drawled. "Bit late for social calls, isn't it?" Reese hesitated. Something in those calm eyes made his gut twist. "We're here to put an end to this," he growled, though his voice cracked on the last word. "Whatever devilry you're working here, it stops tonight." Ephraim only tilted his head. "You misunderstand. We've already stopped. Or rather, we've already finished." From deeper in the house, dozens of small voices began to giggle, layered over with wet, gurgling sighs. A smell like hot iron and rotting flowers wafted out to meet them. Then Silas, Jonah, and Abel stepped into view behind Ephraim, each cradling something swaddled in dark cloth. The bundle squirmed. From one peeked a tiny face, or something that wore a face, its mouth opening far too wide, releasing a thin wail that wove through the bounty hunters' skulls like needles. The men tried to raise their rifles. Most never managed it. Shapes poured from under the porch, from the eaves, from the very earth itself. Dozens of them, clutching at legs, climbing backs, whispering sweet nonsense in voices that sounded like long-lost mothers or lovers. Reese managed a single shot that went wild into the night before hands covered his eyes, warm and sticky. He breathed in, tasting sweet rot, and fell backward into the waiting dark. By dawn, nothing of the bounty hunters remained, not even blood on the porch. Only a faint path of crushed grass, leading away from the farm and into the whispering corn. And from that day forward, the Whitmore children roamed openly. They wandered the abandoned streets of Hayes, peeked through shattered windows, splashed in empty troughs. Sometimes they'd sit together on the steps of the old church, humming songs only they seemed to know, heads tilted in eerie unison. At dusk, the 4 brothers would emerge to gather them up, leading their brood homeward with gentle claps and cooing voices. The little ones scampered eagerly at their heels, their mismatched limbs tangling and untangling like curious vines. And so the farm grew ever fuller, ever more lush, while the rest of Kansas learned to keep well away. Because some horrors do not stay buried. Some take root, spread, and bloom, eager for new soil, new faces, new songs to teach. Chapter 4. The night the horror revealed itself. It began on a sweltering April evening, when the sun bled out across the Kansas sky in grotesque streaks of purple and rust. A hot wind prowled the empty streets of Hayes, rattling loose shutters, stirring dust into whirling ghosts. Though the town had been abandoned by nearly all who once called it home, a handful of desperate souls still clung on, too poor or too stubborn to flee, praying that if they simply kept their heads down, the Whitmores would lose interest. But on that evening something in the air shifted. Birds took wing in frenzied flocks, crying sharp warnings before vanishing over the horizon. Horses bucked in their paddocks until their sides ran slick with foam, eyes rolling in terror. Even the insects seemed to vanish, leaving the field strangely silent. And then came the song. It started as a low, droning hum, seeping through the ground itself. Those still in Hayes felt it first as a vibration beneath their feet, rattling loose nails and floorboards, setting water in pails to ripple in perfect concentric rings. Then the hum rose, twisting into a melody that was wrong in ways no one could quite name, notes that seemed to skip around human hearing, scratching at the mind in places it should never reach. Windows shook in their frames. Dogs threw themselves against doors, whimpering. A sickly perfume bloomed on the wind, heavy with copper and crushed flowers. At the center of it all stood the Whitmore farm, lit up like a cathedral. Dozens of lanterns burned along the fences and walkways, but their flames were greenish, oily, guttering in shapes that sometimes almost looked like faces. The barn doors stood wide open, revealing darkness deeper than any natural shadow. Shapes began to emerge. First came the children, scores of them shambling out on too thin legs, hands brushing the ground, eyes glowing faintly like dying embers. Their mouths worked in silent murmurs, each exhaling puffs of breath that shimmered with tiny motes of light. They clustered together at the edge of the fields, rocking gently as if listening for a distant tune. Then the Whitmore brothers appeared, stepping onto their porch in immaculate black suits. Each carried something cradled to his chest, swaddled bundles that squirmed and cooed with voices that did not belong in this world. Behind them, the house seemed to breathe, its windows pulsing in and out like gills. Without a word, the brothers descended the porch steps. They moved together, always together, gliding across the yard to join their children. Silas raised one hand, long fingers splayed. The humming stopped at once, replaced by a thick, expectant hush. And then Ephraim began to speak. No one close enough to hear would later recall the words. They would only remember the way the syllables seemed to knot around their hearts, squeezing, until they tasted blood in their mouths. The language was not English or any tongue spoken by men. It scraped across the night air like iron dragged over stone, echoing and re-echoing until it felt as if the ground itself were answering back. All at once, the children raised their heads. Mouths opened far too wide, jaws cracking, and they began to sing. Their chorus was a nightmare, layered voices, some high and sweet, others bubbling and wet, harmonizing on notes that twisted in on themselves. It rolled out over the fields, poured down into haze, slid under doors and through the thin walls of abandoned homes. Lights burst on all across town. People stumbled from their beds, clutching their chests, breath catching in their throats. Old Mr. Doolin fell to his knees in his kitchen, hands clawing at his ears, tears streaming down his face as he mouthed a single broken plea, "Make it stop. Please God, make it stop." But God was not listening. Not that night. On the far edge of town, a young widow named Clara Bell tried to flee with her 2 children. She bundled them into her cart, slapping the reins until her mule lurched forward. But the animal stopped dead just 100 yards on, trembling, eyes bulging. It let out a strangled bray, then collapsed, legs folding under it like wet paper. Clara screamed, trying to pull her children free, but small shapes were already spilling from the roadside ditches. They swarmed over the cart wheels, giggling, reaching with hands that left smears of black ichor wherever they touched. One grasped Clara's ankle, its grip cold as ice, impossibly strong, and as she kicked, she saw its face clearly, a twisted parody of a baby's with eyes that blinked side to side like an insect's. She was still screaming when they dragged her under. Back at the Whitmore farm, the brothers stood with arms outstretched. From beneath the earth, from the very roots of their fields, shapes began to rise. Thin, slick, glistening things coated in veils of wet soil. They unwound themselves in slow, languid coils, mouths opening along their lengths, each mouth whispering snatches of lullabies, prayers, curses. The children clapped in delight. Some of them ran forward to embrace the creatures, who bent tenderly to accept them, limbs folding around small bodies in grotesque parody of maternal affection. Above it all, the barn roof cracked open. Not shattered, opened as if split by unseen hands. From within poured a seething darkness that rolled outward like a living fog. Tiny sparks glittered inside it, flaring and dying. And always those voices, chanting, laughing, weeping all at once. One by one, the lanterns lining the Whitmore property went out, swallowed by the spreading gloom. The song grew louder, layering over itself, until it was no longer sound at all but something that could be felt in the bones, a vibration that threatened to shake flesh loose from skeleton. And then, mercifully, it stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. The last echoes of the song faded into the far hills. The strange glow died, plunging everything into honest darkness. When the sun rose the next morning, the Whitmore farm was empty. No sign of the brothers, their children, or the crawling things remained. The barn still stood, but its doors hung ajar, revealing nothing but dry, empty dust within. The fields were bare earth as if no crop had ever grown there at all. But the town of Hayes was changed forever. Those who survived the night found themselves unable to speak of what they had witnessed. Their voices faltered, eyes darting toward the horizon. Some simply packed their things and left, never to be seen again. Others stayed, hollow-eyed, drifting through half-lives, often waking at night with hands pressed to their bellies, whispering nonsense lullabies into the dark. And sometimes, very faintly, the soil around Hayes would pulse, just once, as if something deep below had turned in its sleep. In the days that followed, what little remained of Hayes began to unravel completely. Those few who had stayed found themselves haunted by more than nightmares. Shadows moved behind them in mirrors, lingering half a breath too long. Floors creaked under the weight of invisible feet. At dawn, strange markings sometimes appeared on the door frames, tiny handprints in dark, oily smears that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Animals refused to stay in the town. Chickens broke through fences, vanishing into the prairie. Dogs cowered under beds, whining until their throats went raw. Even crows avoided the rooftops, choosing instead to wheel high overhead, crying warnings to a sky that did not care. Mrs. Abernathy, who had survived by locking herself in her root cellar that terrible night, emerged to find her house utterly transformed. Every surface, walls, tables, even her own bed, was etched with looping spirals, burned deep into the wood as if by a searing iron. In the center of her kitchen floor sat a single daisy, somehow fresh and bright, its petals beaded with droplets that looked unervingly like blood. She fled that morning, barefoot and sobbing, leaving the door swinging wide behind her. Within a month, Hayes was nothing but an abandoned skeleton. Winds swept through empty homes, carrying with them the last echoes of laughter and lullabies that had no place in any sane world. Weeds overran gardens, roots splitting foundations. Dust choked the streets, filling up doorways like drifts of pale snow. And the Whitmore farm? It stood eerily untouched. The house was immaculate, shutters neatly aligned, the porch swept clean. The barn doors remained half open, beckoning. Travelers who came too close claimed they heard gentle weeping from within, soft voices pleading to be found. A few curious souls tried to explore it. None returned. Years later, when a railroad survey crew laid fresh tracks through that part of Kansas, they reported odd findings. Tools rusted overnight. Horses reared and refused to cross certain stretches of earth, frothing at the bit, rolling their eyes in blind panic. One crewman vanished while marking trees at the edge of what had once been the Whitmore property. His fellows searched for days, finally finding his lantern still lit on a stump, but no sign of him, save for a trail of small footprints that led into the corn and simply stopped. By then the name Hayes had already begun to fade from maps. Locals in neighboring counties avoided the area altogether, muttering about old curses, bad ground, the way children sometimes woke screaming with memories of dark barns and voices that promised to love them forever. In the end, the Whitmore's harvest was not a sudden apocalypse, but a quiet infection, seeping outward in unseen tendrils. Farmhands miles away reported dreams of endless rows of corn under a purple sky, tiny figures beckoning from between the stalks. A preacher in Dodge City claimed to hear confessions from strangers who spoke in overlapping voices, eyes glassy, hands twitching with too many joints. Even as far as Wichita, midwives whispered of impossible births, infants with faint spiral marks on their chests, who giggled in their sleep at things no cradle song could explain. Those who tried to trace the source of this spreading blight inevitably found their paths leading back to Hayes. To the neat house and yawning barn, forever waiting under an indifferent sun. And on still nights, if you stood very quietly by the old road, you might hear it too, a low, coaxing song full of promises. Chapter 5. The Roots Beneath. Long before Hayes learned to fear the Whitmores, before whispers of missing children and twisted births, there was only a struggling family on a lonely patch of prairie. In 1861, Ephraim Sr. brought his young bride and newborn son west from Tennessee, chasing the promise of cheap land. They settled near a bend in the Smoky Hill River, where the soil ran dark and rich beneath the sod. Soon followed 3 more sons, Silas, Jonah, and finally little Abel, born with a twisted foot and lungs that wheezed each winter. Life was hard. Droughts burned the corn. Locusts chewed the leaves to lace. Fever swept through the house more than once, leaving the boys gaunt and their mother with a cough that never quite went away. Yet somehow they survived. The ground always yielded just enough to keep them from ruin. The river never ran fully dry, even in the worst summers. Old neighbors used to call it luck. Others muttered that some places were simply hungry, and if you gave them a little blood they might feed you back. As children, the Whitmore boys spent hours wandering the fields. They dug burrows into the creek banks, built little forts from tumbleweed and stone. It was on one such afternoon, with sun blazing white overhead, that they found the first of the holes. Abel had wandered off chasing a frog when the ground gave beneath him. Ephraim heard the scream, thin, ragged, and ran, Silas and Jonah pounding after him. They found Abel lying half in a pit, staring downward with eyes so wide the whites swallowed everything else. When Ephraim hauled him back, Abel didn't resist. He just kept whispering, "They're singing down there. Can't you hear it? They're happy we came." Ephraim crouched at the hole's edge, peering in. It looked like any old animal den at first, dark, musty, lined with slick roots that writhed slightly as if touched by a breeze that didn't exist. But if he strained, holding his breath, he could almost pick up a faint harmony. Tiny voices, giggling just out of reach. He didn't tell their father. He just pulled Abel close and led the others home. The years tumbled on. Their mother's cough grew into a rattle that filled the nights. In spring of '67 she died, skin drawn tight over her bones, eyes sunken. They buried her at the edge of the corn, marking the spot with a simple cross. That evening, Ephraim Sr. sat alone on the porch, bottle in hand, muttering that the ground would take all of them eventually, one by one. That was the night Ephraim heard the singing again, this time from under the floorboards. It started soft, almost playful, like children calling to one another in a meadow. Then it swelled, twisting into harmonies that made his chest ache. The boards beneath his feet felt warm. When he touched them, he swore something on the other side pressed back, small, eager fingers. He jerked away, heart hammering, but couldn't bring himself to wake his brothers. At dawn, he went outside and found the corn rows already humming with flies. Overnight, dozens of blackbirds had fallen dead between the stalks, beaks gaping. Their tiny corpses steamed in the morning chill, each breastbone cracked open, ribs spread like delicate fingers. Inside, no hearts remained. The voices came more often after that. Sometimes under the beds, sometimes from the well when they leaned in to draw water. Always giggling, always beckoning. Little Abel began wandering out at night, feet bare, eyes distant. They'd find him standing in the corn, hands buried in the soil up to the wrists, mouth moving in silent prayer. Jonah was the first to stop being afraid. He began sitting with Abel, tracing patterns in the dirt around him, whispering back to whatever lived beneath. Silas followed soon after, drawn by dreams so vivid he'd wake with nails caked in black earth. Ephraim tried to resist. He prayed, read from the battered family Bible, burned sprigs of juniper in the fireplace. But every morning, new bruises bloomed along his arms in shapes like tiny hands. Then came the sickness. Their father took to bed with chills that soaked the mattress. Ephraim sat by him for days, feeding him thin broth, mopping sweat from his brow. On the fourth night, Ephraim dozed in the chair. He woke to find the room thick with a smell like turned milk. The bedsheets crawled, lumps moving under the quilt. When he pulled it back, dozens of tiny pale things scattered, blind, bloated, mouths opening and closing soundlessly as they wriggled toward the dark corners of the room. His father didn't wake. The man's chest had split open just beneath the ribs, hollow and slick inside, the heart gone. They buried him next to his wife. The very next day, the corn shot up knee-high though it was barely April. Flowers the color of old bruises opened across the graves, petals twitching toward unseen currents. Silas knelt there for hours, eyes closed, humming softly. When he stood, his lips were stained dark. From then on, the brothers changed. Not all at once. At first, it was just small things. They stopped speaking to other farmers when they rode into town. They began to move in an uncanny synchrony, finishing each other's gestures, turning their heads in unison at distant sounds. People who visited noticed the smell around the house. Not foul exactly, more like something rich, ripe, waiting. One night, Ephraim lay awake, listening to the others breathe. The singing rose again, closer than ever. He sat up to see Silas standing by the window, hand pressed against the glass, whispering, "They're here, brother. They've come to show us how." Shapes clustered just outside, silhouettes small and many-jointed, their laughter high and burbling. When Ephraim tried to rise, he found he couldn't move. Tiny hands gripped his ankles through the mattress, pinning him. The floorboards shivered. And then the walls seemed to breathe inward, flexing, drawing him down into a warm, wet dark. By morning, everything was different. The four brothers stood in the yard, arms linked. Beneath their feet, the soil pulsed like a heartbeat. Roots broke through the surface, coiling around their boots, twining up their legs in a lover's embrace. They didn't fight it. They smiled. And when they opened their mouths, the voices that spilled out were not their own. They spoke together in a thick, layered chorus, greeting the day in a tongue older than the stones buried deep under Kansas. Somewhere far below, an answering rumble rolled through the ground, a promise or perhaps a sigh of contentment. The Whitmore farm would never hunger again. And neither would what lived beneath. Chapter 6, The New Harvest. Nearly 40 years had passed since haze withered into dust and whispers. The roads that once led wagons and laughter into town were little more than faint scars across the prairie. The wind laid claim to broken fences, lifting away splinters like old scabs. Foundations sank under weeds, rooftops caved under snow and time. But the Whitmore farm endured. Its fields lay strangely lush, even in the harshest drought. Birds built nests in its eaves, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of what had once nested there before them. The house stood solid, paint only slightly peeled, windows still clean enough to catch the sun in blinding glares. Sometimes, if you were close enough to squint, you might swear the curtains fluttered from within, though no breeze disturbed the yard. Most maps quietly erased haze, though older homesteaders still marked it with a grim curl of the lip, refusing to go near. Yet Kansas was growing again. Railroads carved new veins through the state, promising opportunity. Telegraph wires rose like metal vines. People were hungry for land, any land, cheap and waiting. That's how the Lovell family came west. It was 1915 and Thomas Lovell, his wife Miriam, and their 3 children were desperate for a fresh start. Back in Ohio, a failed harvest had ruined them. Debt stalked Thomas like a hungry dog. So when he heard rumor of vast empty plots in Kansas, abandoned but shockingly fertile, he could not pack fast enough. They arrived on a brilliant spring morning. Wildflowers bobbed in the breeze, catching Miriam's breath in delight. Little Ruth skipped ahead, braids flying, while Samuel and baby Clara dozed in the wagon. Even Thomas found his spirits lifting. The farmhouse seemed solid, the barns large, the pastures practically humming with life. The locals who sold him the deed, 2 silent, sunburned men from Dodge City, offered it at a price so low Thomas nearly laughed. He didn't pause to wonder why. Hard men didn't ask many questions. By nightfall they'd made beds of blankets on the wooden floor. Miriam lit a small lamp, whispering that this house felt strangely warm, like someone left the hearth burning for us. Thomas only grinned, relief flooding through him. Finally, after years of scraping by, they had a chance to thrive. The first weeks were near perfect. The soil was indeed rich, turning every seed Thomas planted into riotous green. The well never dropped more than a few inches even when he drew bucket after bucket. Ruth roamed the fields with bare feet, returning each evening with armfuls of strange, soft flowers that smelled sweet enough to make Miriam dizzy. But small oddities gathered like storm clouds. Ruth began talking in her sleep. At first simple murmurs, childish nonsense. Then full conversations, giggling responses to questions no one else could hear. Sometimes Thomas would find her outside at dawn, standing barefoot on the cold ground, hands clasped in front of her chest as if in prayer, eyes half-lidded. Once, Miriam woke to find little Clara missing from her crib. Panic seized her. She tore through the house, calling wildly, until she found the baby lying in the kitchen, cooing at a neat line of ants marching toward her open hand. When Miriam scooped her up, the insects scattered, but the floor where Clara had lain was faintly warm. Stranger still were the neighbors. They began arriving in the evenings, appearing unannounced at the gate. Men and women with broad shoulders, pale eyes that never quite settled, smiles that seemed to stretch too long before breaking. They would stand there for hours, hands clasped, staring at the farmhouse. When Thomas hailed them, they nodded politely, turned, and walked back into the dark without a word. One night, Thomas awoke to soft singing drifting through the open window. Peering out, he caught sight of dozens of figures standing among his corn. Lanterns bobbed between them, throwing shadows that danced along the stalks in grotesque pantomime. Some of the figures were small, very small, skipping circles around the taller ones. The song rose in a sweet, spiraling harmony, then fell into low chuckles that seemed to vibrate through Thomas's bones. When he blinked, the lights were gone. The field stood empty. A week later, Ruth brought home a new blossom, unlike any Miriam had seen before. Its petals were deep crimson, so dark they were nearly black and slick with a sap that stained Ruth's hands. Miriam scolded her gently, rinsing her palms in warm water. But that night, Ruth began to hum the same wandering tune Thomas had heard in the fields. It leaked from her lips in her sleep, twisting into giggles that didn't sound like her own. By morning, the flower lay on the kitchen table, still impossibly fresh. Tiny roots stretched from its stem across the wood, seeking the grooves, threading themselves deeper as if nesting. Thomas tried to burn it in the stove. It wouldn't catch. The flames curled around it, refusing to touch. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, shadows gathered on the road. Dozens of figures approached the farmhouse, moving in eerie, swaying unison. At their front walked 4 broad-shouldered men in dark coats. Though decades had passed, they looked unchanged, eyes pale and eager, smiles gentle but unyielding. Ephraim lifted a hand in greeting. "Evening, Mr. Lovell. Such a fine crop you have. Might we come in? It's nearly time for the harvest." Thomas stood frozen on the porch, rifle hanging limp in his grip. Miriam clutched baby Clara behind him, her breath coming in tiny shudders. Ruth only smiled, slipping from her mother's grasp to run down the steps, arms outstretched. The nearest of the children, thin-limbed, eyes bright with mirth, caught her hands and spun her in a playful whirl. They laughed together, a sound that went on far too long, looping back on itself. Behind them, the corn began to sway though there was no wind. Something moved through the stalks, low, rippling as if the earth itself had grown restless. Ephraim stepped forward, boots whispering on the dry grass. "It's all right," he murmured, voice soft as milk. "This land gives so much. All it ever asks is a little love in return. A little family." Thomas tried to raise the rifle. His arms wouldn't obey. Miriam let out a tiny sob, pressing her lips to Clara's downy head. Ruth squealed in delight as more small hands reached for hers. And then the children of the field surged forward. No one saw the Lovell family again. Weeks later, a mail coach rolled through what remained of Hayes and found the farmhouse pristine. Fresh paint gleamed on the door. Laughter drifted from the backyard, where children played under the watchful eyes of 4 tall men. New flowers bloomed thick around the porch, black and purple, sticky with sap. The driver didn't linger. He snapped his reins until the horses bolted, vowing never to return. As summer deepened, travelers along the railway began speaking of strange sights. Fields that glowed faintly under the moon, crowds gathered among the stalks, singing songs no one recognized. In nearby towns, mothers woke to find tiny handprints pressed into the dust of their windowsills. Cattle balked at crossing old wagon roads that once led to Hayes. And always in the distance the Whitmore house stood waiting. Curtains fluttered at its windows as if someone inside waved hello. Smoke rose from its chimney, thick and fragrant. The harvest had come again, and this time, it was only beginning. Epilogue. Decades turned into dust on the Kansas wind. By the 1950s, there was little left to mark where Hayes once stood. Old county records listed it as dissolved, its charter voided, its streets returned to prairie. Maps showed only a pale smudge of fields, threaded by nameless dirt roads. But sometimes the land itself refused to forget. A truck driver's tale, 1957. James Holloway, a long-haul driver, recounted it years later in a Wichita bar. He'd been hauling grain west along Highway 40, forced off the main road by a washed-out bridge. The detour led him along narrow gravel paths, past low fences tangled in morning glory. Twilight fell quick. His headlights caught a sign half buried in weeds. Hayes, 2 miles. He tried to turn around. The engine sputtered, died. When he stepped out to check under the hood, he heard laughter drifting over the fields. At first he thought it was coyotes. Then it turned melodic, children's voices, layered over in eerie rounds. He fled on foot, stumbling through knee-high grass until he found the highway again by sheer luck. When the tow arrived at dawn, the truck was gone. Just tire ruts in the dirt, vanishing into rows of corn that hadn't been there the night before. The researchers, 1964. A pair of anthropology students from KU made it their summer project to find the ghost town of Hayes. They were drawn by rumors of old homesteads swallowed by the earth, stories of children seen playing in fields that didn't appear on any aerial surveys. They pitched a tent on what old plat books said had been Main Street. By lantern light, they recorded notes about broken foundations and weathered gravestones. The next morning, one student woke alone. His partner's sleeping bag lay open and empty, zipper torn clean through. Small footprints circled the tent, pressed deep into the soil. They trailed off toward a distant copse of trees that, by every botanical map, should not exist on that flat Kansas plain. When authorities arrived, they found the remaining student sitting cross-legged in the grass, eyes wide, humming a soft, looping lullaby. He never recovered enough to explain what he'd seen. A local story, 1973. In nearby Salina, old farmers still pass stories over coffee at the grain elevator. About livestock refusing to cross certain fields. About fences that seemed to shift by inches overnight, as if the land itself were nudging them. One man swore he'd found a calf dead on his property, no marks save for a spiral burned into its flank. When he cut it open, the heart was missing, not torn or eaten, simply absent, cavity smooth and bloodless. He sold the farm within the month. A drifter's journal, found 1986. Long after, a tattered leather notebook surfaced in a thrift shop. It contained rambling entries dated 1985, written by a man hitchhiking through Kansas. The last pages were smeared with dirt, the handwriting cramped and erratic. Met some kids by the road today. Big eyes, big smiles. Asked if I wanted to see their farm. I followed. Couldn't help it. Like a hook in my ribs. There's a house there. White paint, red roof. Pretty. Smells sweet. Their fathers are waiting inside. They said they've been hungry for visitors. The journal ended there. The land waits. Today, only satellite images tell the story. Fields around the old Hayes coordinates bloom deeper green than surrounding plots, even in drought years. No one builds there. Attempts fail, paperwork lost, construction equipment breaks down without cause. Truckers keep to highways, ignoring shortcuts across the prairie. Survey planes sometimes report strange patterns in the corn, broad spirals visible only from above. Locals blame kids with boards, though no footprints ever mar the dirt. And still they sing. If you stand very quietly on a windless night, especially in late summer when the crops are high, you might hear it. A thin melody rising from the ground itself, weaving through the stalks. It might sound like children playing a game. It might sound like dozens of tiny voices giggling just beyond the edge of hearing. If you're wise, you'll leave then, boots quick on the road, never pausing to look back. Because some say if you stay too long, you'll see lanterns appear among the rows, green and oily, bobbing toward you in perfect rhythm. You'll see tall figures step from the corn, smiling gently, hands outstretched in welcome. And behind them the smaller shapes will be waiting. Eager. Hungry.